Good morning, everyone. Welcome on a Monday morning to our first feedback session. My name is Cheryl Allen. I work as the Deputy Superintendent at the Office of Public Instruction. Zach Hawkins, who is our co-facilitator on Chapter 58, is out of town this week. So I get the fortunate privilege of getting to be with you this morning. And each of our groups is facilitated by an OPI staff member as well as a member of the Comprehensive Center. And our co-chair from the Comp Center this morning's daughter is having tonsil removal, so she won't be with us. But I'd like to get us started this morning. If you'll just take a moment and introduce yourselves. And then I'll update you on what has occurred with the Chapter 58 task force, which has met twice, and ensure that our time together is spent, that we make certain we get what's important on your mind related to Chapter 58, which for us is educator prep. And I'll share with you some of the thoughts from others as well. It's been interesting the last couple of times. So Christine, if we could get you to start with introductions, that would
Sure. Be. Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. I'm Christine Lux. I'm an associate professor of early childhood education at Montana State University. Thanks for having me. Good to be part of the group.
Thanks for being here.
Sure.
Esty.
Hi, I have not great internet, so I'm going to leave my camera off if that's okay.
You bet.
I am Esty Aiken at the University of Montana Western. I'm a professor and the chair of the Division of Education.
We're happy you're with us. Sarah.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Sarah Pennington. I'm an assistant professor at Montana State University Bozeman and also the program leader for the teacher ed program.
Terrific. We're happy you're with us. Adria, nice to have you with us this morning as well.
Thank you. I'm Adria Lawrence. I'm the Dean of the College of Education at the University of Montana in Missoula.
Tricia.
Good morning, I'm Tricia Seifert. I'm an associate professor in adult and higher education at MSU and former department head. And honestly, just really interested in education policy and how we support teachers and learners.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Anne, good morning.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Anne Eubank, and I'm the current department head for the Department of Education at Montana State. Nice to see everybody this morning.
Nice to see you. Megan.
Good morning. I'm Megan Chilson from University of Montana Western, and I'm a professor in the Health and Human Performance Department.
Did I miss anybody? Double checking.
Cheryl, my name's Emily Salee. I'll jump on in if that's okay.
Sorry, Emily.
That's okay.
Please.
Not to worry. I'm on faculty in the Department of Counseling at University of Montana, and I'm also the director of the Montana Safe Schools Center housed in the College of Ed there. And I'm also representing the Montana School Counselor Association, being on the board of directors with that organization as well. So good morning to all, and so excited to be here and be part of this group.
Great. Thank you. And again, we're pleased to have you with us. So we've got two different series of rules underway right now. Chapter 58, which is our primary focus, and the other is on educator licensing. So I'll briefly share with you what the hot topic is with them right now. And it actually is around counselor education preparation. Most importantly, related to that is we have had numerous counselors that have gone through the preparation to become school principals. But without 3 years of actual teaching experience with the teaching license, you cannot get licensed in the state of Montana. And so we have folks that are sitting on the borders with other states saying, I can get licensed to be a principal here. I can drive 30 miles. What needs to happen in Montana? Since my short time, I've been in this role now 12 months. In that short time, I know of 4 different counselors that have gone in front of the Board of Public Ed seeking a waiver to that rule. We've not been successful with those, though the Board of Public Ed has said, thank goodness we're looking at Chapter 57. So I want you to be aware of that. And as you would expect, there's varying viewpoints on whether or not the work of a school counselor would equate to the same work of a teacher. And this is what I've shared with folks, having over 25 years of school administrative experience as a building principal. Anytime I had to be out of the building, who was the person I asked to be responsible for the day? Especially when you don't have an assistant principal. Who would you guess?
The counselor.
The counselor, right? So we see the counselor doing a lot of those kinds of functions and work. So we'll make certain that you're updated regularly on that process, because we know it's important that we work to keep Montana folks in Montana. We have, as you're probably aware, a pretty significant shortage going on right now in the state of Montana. So I can share some data with you. The number of emergency authorizations that came to the OPI this past year, so impact of COVID, was 184. Prior year was 79. And so we're seeing an increase there. We can tell you the number of teachers that were placed in out of teacher assignments increased by 50% this past year. Again, we think those are impacts of COVID, and we'll send you all this data. I've got our folks putting those into trend lines for you so you can see what's happening. But when we talk with our principals and superintendents, we keep hearing the same thing. We don't have enough teacher capacity to meet the needs. And we think it's exacerbated by COVID. So we know the work that we do in both of these is equally important towards ensuring that we have capable quality educators for our Montana classrooms. And so share that little background with you. I see Christopher has joined us. Christopher, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, sorry about that.
No worries.
Yeah, I'm Christopher Bush. I'm from Montana, MSU Northern, excuse me, and I'm in the teacher education program there. I have over 20 years teaching experience and some years of admin experience.
Terrific. We're happy you're with us as well. And it's always good to see the diversity of representation on these calls. So Chapter 58, Educator Prep, asked the question, we started with the question, what would a quality educator prep program look like? What would be those attributes? So I'll ask you that same question. What would a quality educator prep program in Montana look like? What would be those attributes?
Well, first and foremost, I believe that teacher education programs need to develop a foundation of pedagogy and teaching pre-service teachers the skills that it takes to be able to teach content to students of various grade levels. And I think that takes many forms. I think that one of the big problems that we have right now is kind of the role and direction that curriculum or curricula design has gone. And so in a lot of states, you know, curriculum has been set up to almost be a type of scripted teaching, if you will. And that's not pedagogy. It's just a tool. And so making sure that pre-service teachers understand that they are the the leader of the class. They're the orchestrator of the learning experience. So it's not just about content. It's not just about content knowledge. It's actually more about being able to create and modify learning experiences for each child in the classroom.
Thank you, Christopher. I appreciate those thoughts. Others?
I think one of the hallmarks of our teacher prep programs across the state are diverse field experiences, early and sustained field experiences, so that our candidates, they're getting to see and know what a classroom feels like early on. And then if this is not the right path for them, then they can invest their time and energies elsewhere. I think the growth that I've seen as a teacher educator of students who get to be in the field as early as freshman year, and having some experience having done this out of state in my home state of Massachusetts, it's really powerful to see those early experiences and what those translate to when they get to their capstone and their student teaching. So I feel like a quality teacher prep program really is about diverse experiences, rural experiences, just in experiences with a wide variety of learners, so that we can understand how to modify and what that looks like, whether that's responding to children's and students' emotional needs, looking at their cognitive development, but looking at all those domains as being really important and having experiences to practice that.
Thank you. Appreciate that. We heard that frequently from the task force as well, those early field experiences sustained, how important those are. Others? Other thoughts?
Well, I'll go ahead and jump in. And I need to leave at 8:30, Cheryl. So I apologize for that.
No worries, Ann. We're happy you're here.
Great. So in addition to what Chris and Christine shared, I've been thinking about our P20 orientation at our university and in our department, and thinking really intentionally about how PK through 12 schools are actually part of the educator preparation program in Montana. We cannot prepare teachers without the mutually beneficial partnership of those PK-12 institutions. And so making sure that our teacher preparation programs are in constant communication with the field, and ensuring that what we do on our side is beneficial for the schools. And I will add, one thing that I've been thinking really carefully about is that, we could keep our students for 10 years and still not teach them everything they need to know. There is just no possible way. And I've been thinking about the ARM that requires school trustees to set up a mentoring and induction program. And that's an unfunded mandate. And so to me, there's a little bit of a disconnect there, where our teacher preparation programs are not necessarily folding into very structured and sustained mentoring and induction programs, just like a medical residency would be, for example. And so I'd just like to share that orientation, because I don't think that looking at educator preparation standards in isolation from the PK-12 schools that help us to prepare those teachers and then have the responsibility of mentoring and induction. We just need to work together. And I think that's the most important thing.
Thank you. Thank you.
I would add that with the other things that folks have mentioned, including the pedagogical foundation and being able to craft and adapt learning experiences for students, with the field experience, I think there's a lot of value in coaching, not just from cooperating teachers, but also from EPP faculty members. And we, I know, collectively try and make sure that our candidates have that kind of really active coaching. and it helps fuse and toggle together, interweave, if you will, the coursework and the field experiences that our candidates have.
Nice. Thank you.
I would add that a quality educator prep program addresses the needs of the whole child so that students are student ready on day one, especially in our changing world, that it's far more. Of course, we need to work on pedagogy. Of course, we need to instill content knowledge to whatever degree we can. But as Anne said, they're never going to have everything. I mean, I think practicing teachers sometimes never have everything. So helping our students understand the learners with whom they will be working, and that it is an ever-changing field. So instilling the ability to be a lifelong learner as well. So as you're preparing to be an educator, how do you continue to grow yourself throughout your career? I think that's because we can't do it all. So quality educator prep programs prepare teachers to be lifelong learners and to meet the needs of the whole child.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Ties pretty strongly to what was shared as well. And the relationship was emphasized over and over and over. And what does it take to build relationships? I think I was in my third year of teaching when the phrase that came to the forefront was, kids don't care what you know till they know that you care about them. And so we can be content experts and the likes, but at the core of that whole child and that relationship, if the inability, and Christine, as you said, it's important that you know early on this is for you or it's not for you. So you shift gears. And I can tell you that in my career, I have coached out numerous teachers that found out they just didn't like working with kids. They just didn't like working with kids. And you gotta like working with kids if you're going to be in this profession. So I was fortunate to have the privilege of helping coach them towards different fits. So that R word has been emphasized pretty profoundly. A couple of other thoughts that came through pretty profoundly, and we tapped on this before. So we've talked about the constitutional mandate in Article 10 for Montana, which says the education system is established to develop the full education potential of each person. And that was back in 1972. So I've been fortunate to be on the forefront in our state of individualizing and personalizing learning for kids. So when you talk about each person, it really is that emphasis that Christopher commented earlier, those learning experiences for each child, because we know that today in the third decade of the 21st century, that we do have the tools and ability to meet kids right where they're at. Each student right where they're at. The challenge becomes that you have a classroom of diverse learners, whether it's 20 in the early grades or 25 to 30 from grades 4 on, which is where those breakdowns show up in another set of arms. It's that ability to say that each one of those kids has unique and different needs within those. And so one of our parents that was on the call said the reason they're there is they want to ensure that we individualize learning to each child, and that our teachers entering the profession have the skill set and the pedagogical understanding of individualization of learning. So as you said, in a lifetime, you never capture it all because it's constantly shifting as your kids shift and change. But spot on that it's all about the ability of, are we creating the mindset and the culture of the continuous learning of teachers as they go through those transition phases, of which there are many. From the field, it's if you can keep a teacher for 5 years, you have a greater likelihood that they'll make a career out of the profession. If you lose them prior to that, it becomes pretty challenging. The other component that is heavy on my mind as well is second career teachers. So folks that determine leaving industry, troops to teachers, and other facets of saying, hey, I think I can give back. And what are those mechanisms that we can put in play to make that second career path doable without being in a four-year undergraduate process again, but taking the skill sets that they have. Yeah, troops to teachers is gone today, but that was a mechanism. And I've got lots of colleagues that have gone through Teach for America and those non-traditional paths that work forward. So continuously looking at how we can build those bridges of where there's potential, at least in the world I'm living these days, where there's potential that we can capture folks that would love to contribute to teaching and the lives of kids. So those were the key issues. Stevie out of Rocky made this statement. It was most interesting to me, she said, that not a single person mentioned content, the development of academic content and related, but that all the discussions were on what I just call the other stuff. And so when you think about that, and we did tap slightly on that, but when you think about all of the demands on a classroom teacher today, what can we do to ensure quality? And that's the nebulous word. When you think about all those demands, right? And during the pandemic, as many of our faculty at the post-secondary experienced, it shifted. You had to be able to meet students in a digital environment. And if you didn't have that skill development, it was a whole new adventure. Your students had to meet that demand if they hadn't been in that environment yet. And the teachers in the K-12, when Governor Bullock shut down the state, he shut down our schools. And they had 2 weeks to prepare to open in a virtual environment, right? And so I remember lots of teachers saying, I was busy at the copy machines late at night putting together packets that could go home. I remember talking with other colleagues that said we'd already implemented one-to-one in our school system 3 to 5 years ago. So the transition for us was a little easier. And those stories were vast and diverse. And so what are we doing to ensure quality and that our teachers are entering that field with that learning mindset, or the dark horse mindset, or the growth mindset available to them to ensure that they can ensure the quality of learning? So what does educator prep need to have in their wheelhouse for it to meet quality? Because that's one of the key words that we find in our arms.
I'm not sure anyone has brought this up yet, but classroom management is an area that I've seen so many young teachers weak in. As I've been a university supervisor for over 10 years, and almost always classroom management and the classroom environment are the two areas that I need to work with them prior to even beginning to address their content knowledge or their pedagogy.
Thanks, Erin.
Yeah, Erin, that's a really good point. And I'll just share that 3 years ago, in preparation for accreditation, which we work on every day, it's just a continuous thing, but we aligned the in-task standards to the chapter 58, and to our surprise, classroom management isn't really mentioned in chapter 58 at all. But the national standards mention it. So that would be a really good area of alignment that could strengthen chapter 58 for sure. Thanks for bringing that up, Erin. Yeah, we
And
were
I'll
really
build on-
surprised.
And I'll build on that because it relates to your comment about P12 to higher ed alignment, that the work that we've done through our Cedar Center partnership and our Big Sky 5 of the 5 high leverage practices that we expect our candidates to be prepared with leaving our programs. We heard that again and again from our stakeholders, that how are you addressing management? And it actually circles back to something Cheryl mentioned, relationships, that's a high leverage practice. There's not a high leverage practice to manage children. And actually even the language around classroom management is really a negative stance in a lot of regards, but promoting relationships is very positive and something that we could promote in chapter 58, that is tangible. It's hard to see a managed classroom, and we can see relationships, and we can build relationships. We can teach relationship building. So I think that's it relates directly to Erin's comment and Anne's comment.
Thanks,
Well, I think one of the things that we kind of dance around, but we don't really talk about at all, is time. Is that, I mean, it's that aspect of time. And definitely in the teacher education programs, that is something that comes up a lot, because we chunk everything down into specific, content areas, classroom management, curriculum design, methods. But what I've heard a lot of my students talk about is, well, you don't put it all together. You don't show us a pie chart that tells us, okay, we have all these chunks and this is the percentage of time I need to be spending on all of these chunks. And then we don't correlate that with the fact that students learn at their own rate, and that building relationships take time. And so that whole understanding of how do we navigate that learning process while fitting in all of the boundaries that have been set for teachers as far as standards, curriculum use, lesson pacing guides, all of that. But then they're like, well, wait a minute, but I'm supposed to be building a relationship. I'm supposed to be covering all these standards. And, and then with that, it's like, well, we hear that, Harry Wong says the first 2 weeks are most important. And then you hear about, other innovators that talk about the Smart Start, where they don't cover any content directly for the first 2 weeks. It's all classroom management. It's all learning classroom design, getting everyone all on the same page, getting everyone in the same team, getting everyone moving in the same direction, focusing on learning. But then you hear administrators say, what? No. You can't spend 2 weeks getting on that stuff. You need to be hitting the books right away. We need those pacing guides. You got to get all these chapters in. And so, back to the starting comments about the counselor education going into admin, and that understanding that admin is supposed to be the instructional leader for the campus, but yet counselors are emotional leaders, and they help with that, that balance, if you will. So it actually is, the perfect would be a, principal, vice principal, leader / counselor combination. So all of our admins should have half of counseling classes in their programs.
A little relatedly, to build on what Essie and Erin were saying, I think in terms of classroom management, or whatever we want to call it, in addition to the importance of relationships, there seems to be a lack of understanding around basic behavior and being developmentally appropriate in that conversation as well, how it changes and develops over the course of PK-12 education. And part of that is considering how trauma shows up in the classroom and how to be responsive to that in a way that's engaged and not reactive. So that often feels, in terms of my lens as a school counselor and now a school counselor educator, that often feels missing. And it often feels like something teachers, whether they're in their first year or in their 30th year, are lacking. So I'd like to throw that out there too.
Thank you. it's a key point, and one of the elements is we're doing tremendous work around trauma informed throughout the state in the K-12 environment. And I was on a call last week with the director of our Indian student achievement, and she just paused and the tears started flowing. And as we talk about what things need to look different, like in education, and they flowed, and she said, until we can address the behaviors, and she uses historical trauma quite frequently, until we can address the behaviors that have become part of our culture. She goes, I don't know how we get there. And then the tears started flowing even more as she started talking about another family member gets raped, or another child gets stolen, and it's at the core of this work. And we know we have a mandate to ensure that our tribal cultures across the state are infused. And it's a high priority in Chapter 58 with the Advisory Council on Indian Education that advises the OPI and the Board of Public Ed, is that in Chapter 58, we really get more depth around our students. And we don't know what that looks like yet. We just know that at the core of what 11% of our student population is our American Indian students. I would also share with you that numerous grants that the OPI acquires to work with our school districts are reliant upon that 11% that usually have 100% poverty rate, and that list goes on and on. And what we're hearing from those schools is we just get a path started, and then another grant comes at us. So now we're diverting, trying to say, how do we meet this grant? And how do we meet this grant? And how do we meet this grant? So we're really starting our conversations right now with, and it's really important in that P20, we're starting our conversations with the tribal councils and the community leaders, and looking at how we take that holistic view that we can't work in isolation, as what Anne had described earlier for us as well. We can't be over in higher ed looking at doing things this way, and we go out to the tribal council and they're taking a different path, and we come over to the OPI and there's several different paths depending on what is the arena being addressed. But that if indeed we're going to figure out how we address that whole child and trauma and build relationships, it's going to take a concerted effort on our part. The OPI has been charged with the legislature in this last session with a couple of things. One of those is the community-based treatment services in schools. So all Medicaid services to schools got moved from DPHHS to the OPI. So in this conversation that we're having, we recognize that we're foraying into new federal ground and going to need lots of help. The other one that came to us actually was transferred from the Department of Commerce. The Department of Commerce had for years language and cultural preservation of the tribes sat in the Department of Commerce as from the approach of tourism. So this last legislative session, they determined that it would be at the OPI. And so as we work around those things, we're going to be talking with you as well in the elements of educator prep and how we ensure that our students entering the K-12 arena have got a really solid foundation in understanding all of the students that they're going to be serving. So would share that with you as another one of the items that came up in 58. What other thoughts do you have around quality?
I'd like to share and actually invite Esty to talk a little bit about the work that she and Jane Downey and members of the Cedar Grant had done to arrive at this infographic, which Esty shared, because I think it really demonstrates a statewide consultative and systematic approach to talking about what should our completers be able to know and do on day one as they move into school. So Esty, that was just me introducing your good work.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Tricia.
Tricia. I'm sorry, I got dropped from the call for a minute, but I'm back now, so it seems like that was good timing. I'll just say that if you're not familiar with the Teaching Works high leverage practices, that's where some of our work began. And if you're not familiar with the CEDAR initiative, we've been involved in CEDAR work for about 8 years as a state. And that's out of University of Florida. It's an OSEP grant focusing on how to prepare all teachers to work with students of all ability levels. So what we've been working on, Jane and I and a group, actually people on this call have worked with CEDAR work as well. We came to that Big Sky 5 out of 19 high leverage practices and about 1.5 years of stakeholder input, including the Macy group that oversees Native American integration and Native American education. And so the 5 that we settled on were because our stakeholders said we should. So I think that's that when you look at that Big Sky 5, basically we tasked them with our students, as Anne mentioned, they can't do all 19 of, they can't secure all 19 of these high leverage practices in 4 years, but what can we do? And we based this on a model out of Michigan. And we decided that these 5 would be a good stepping stone. And that leaves 14 that we thought would have to fall within induction. And that has also been mentioned that induction, chapter 58 only takes us so far. It's unfortunate to think of teacher preparation as terminal. I graduated and therefore I am. So I think that when we look at the Big Sky 5, we've said, and what our stakeholders said, and our stakeholders included many admin as well. And that's where, again, management and relationships arose to say that we can't do everything, but what can we say on day one our teachers will be ready for? And that Big Sky 5 is what came to light as we can do this. We can do this across our 10 EPPs to really kind of move the dial on getting people ready for the classroom. Oh, okay. Yes, I bet it was because of your phone. I will email it to you, Erin, in just a second. And just as a plug, we've now designed a hub module that I think is ready to go live that addresses those 5 HLPs, and it's housed through the OPI hub, and it just introduces them. And it was designed with a dual audience of you might be a pre-service teacher and that module might be embedded in coursework, but you might be a mentor teacher who needs to understand the HLPs to host a student teacher. You might be a first or second year teacher in the field. You might be a veteran teacher in the field and just getting them up to speed on the 5 high leverage practices that we call the Big Sky 5. So I hope that's enough, but if you have questions, please let me know. We're kind of deep in the CEDAR work now and looking for scale up. And so we really want to get that Big Sky 5 embedded.
Thank you. Other thoughts, comments? So as you think about the work in educator prep, what are the issues that are heavy on your mind? I just listened to ensuring that we're able to get the Big Sky 5 embedded and part of the work that happens both with pre-service teachers, but also with active teachers in the field. I'll be sure that this gets sent to everybody, as well as I see that out of chat we're having some talks on that. So I will make certain the PDF gets emailed to everybody, so you have that. What other thoughts or issues are heavy on your mind that you're saying we'd want to make certain this was in the discussion?
One issue that I see in the rural schools is having new teachers who are actually prepared with that 00 license to teach all subjects, kindergarten through 8th grade, which is a very big charge and really virtually impossible. So that teaching teachers to be lifelong learners certainly helps fill that gap, but not entirely, because there is so much content that's required, and there's a lot of pre-service teaching experiences that are required, even more than they already have, which is quite a few, in order for them to feel versatile themselves, like that they can drop into kindergarten or jump up to 8th grade. And even if they don't know all the content or all the teaching methodologies, they can learn them because they have that skill set built into their pre-service teaching experience.
Thank you, Erin.
I have to say this because I worked on chapter 58 in previous revisions, and we worked really hard for gifted ed to be represented in any way. And it wasn't, and it was, it felt very politicized that we're not allowed to talk about gifted kids. And I have to say it has to go on record that gifted kids and working with high ability, high potential, as we call them in Montana, those students deserve to learn something new every day. And I think it actually fits contextually very well in a conversation about individualization and differentiation. But we have some major issues with gifted ed in the state, and we have new legislation just coming out of this legislative cycle that we need to focus there. And it's a disservice to pretend that we're protecting anybody by omitting that language from chapter 58. Last time we were encouraged by OPI staff who no longer are at OPI, so I don't feel bad in saying it, that we needed to address gifted ed from the lens of special education and really use some of that same boilerplate language. And I don't think that actually addresses needs of different learners. And it falls in the context too of twice exceptionality, where there is a cross between gifted ed and special ed services. But ultimately, the language may not make the final cut, but I want to go on the record as having expressed a real desire to see it there.
Great. Thanks, Esty. I appreciate that.
Well, and I feel like that is part and parcel of teaching every student and enhancing every single student's whole well-being. And so to not support gifted and talented or high performing and potential students misses that mandate. And so I think in teaching all learners and customizing for their learning situation, gifted students are part of the conversation.
Exactly. I thought exactly, if we're meeting the full education potential of each person, it includes each person, including students of high ability, high adaptability, high potential. Thank you. What else is on your mind related to educator prep?
I'd like to kind of bring up the student teaching experience. I was fortunate enough when I went through my program in North Carolina that my student teaching experience was a 1-year student teaching experience, where my first day of this fall semester was the first teacher day, and my last day of the spring semester was the last teacher day at the school. And then what the university did was they kind of weaved in some seminar courses and a couple of other courses in the fall to be able to meet all of the demands of the program. But that was kind of the thing that they found in running that program for all those years, is that the 1-year experience was paramount for the student teacher, because they got to see the whole transition of an academic year, and the behavior management was completely different than the traditional student teaching experience of 12 or 16 weeks. And I know that myself and my peers, they all felt completely prepared to step into the classroom that very first year. 100%. There was no doubt, no fear, no anything. They felt they had it because it was almost like an advanced induction period, but yet it was part of the program. So what it did was it added it was basically a 5th year of college, but that was our student teaching experience, and it allowed for the full 2 years of coursework to be more manageable. Currently, with the program that we have set up at Northern, students feel rushed, like there's all this stuff we got to do. We got all these hours we have to put out in the field, and they're getting burnt out before they even get into the profession. And that pressure and that pushing is causing a lot of questions in their minds. And so one thing that we've done is we have orchestrated our Practicum 3 course to be the same classroom teacher as their student teaching. So they are actually getting kind of a 1 year with the teacher, even though it is modified for the fall to accommodate all the courses. But the course load is intense. And so when we go back to that discussion that we've had about we can't teach them everything, and so what is it that we teach them? And we kind of negotiate out that, and then we work with OPI and we negotiate that, and I mean all those different negotiations on what they need to learn, and it seems to change over time. But the one thing that doesn't change is that situated learning experience and the integration of all those situated learning experiences within the content courses of the program. And so I feel personally that our education programs are too short and too compact, and not not focusing on that. I mean, we're all focused on preparing them for the classroom. However, we also are held to those different standards that we have to meet, the different subject matters courses we have to teach. And I mean, like last semester we took a assessment course and a curriculum design course, basically cut them in half and put them together. And it's like, well, I don't think that personally worked very well, but that's what we did. But again, it goes back to that jockeying of what percentage of what content are we going to teach them to prepare them for the classroom. So, but I think that student teaching experience needs to be longer than it currently is. I don't believe it serves its purpose to prepare the student adequately.
So what are your thoughts around paid student teaching experience, as opposed to this being an unpaid experience?
Well, I think the unpaid experience is the traditional model, and and the unpaid internship, I think, kind of is a way of the past. I believe there's a lot of red tape that needs to be worked through, because now you're talking about districts paying student teachers to actually be part of that experience. Then you got the universities wanting their portion and needing the time. And then it's the control. Who is in control of the student teacher and what they have to achieve? And one of the things that I tell all of my students is that even though you're getting more and more embedded in the schools, there's always a need, right? They're always going to ask you to do things, but until you get your credential, you are not done. So anything that prevents you from achieving your credential, you need to put on hold until you get your credential. So don't get caught up in, oh yeah, I need to coach, I need to be a yard duty support, or because I need all this experience in the schools. It's like, yes, you're going to get that. However, I know you're got all that energy and you're ready to jump in, but just remember, the goal is to get your credential first. And so you need to focus on spending the time that it takes, and again, goes back to that time discussion, to learn the materials that have been set forth before you to prepare you for your career, not just your first year or two.
Thanks, Chris. Anyone else?
I was going to add something earlier and didn't quite know where it fit in until Chris just shared all of that, because I am thinking about the attrition rate of novice teachers and how that needs to be on our mind in terms of training quality teachers that also then stay for longer than a year or two before they leave. And I wonder if what Chris was sharing and the potential for having a fifth year or whatever that looks like of a paid student teaching might reduce the teacher attrition in terms of providing that intensive support during that kind of the first year of teaching while they're actually also finishing up their program at the same time. I'm thinking of some other states and their credentialing for school counselors, and even for some collaboration that UM is doing with MSU in putting our school counseling interns into rural sites where they then are provided a stipend to stay in a rural setting after graduation. So there might be some potential for borrowing from some of those ideas to offer some payment around supporting teachers while they're in their first year and possibly still in the program, like Chris was talking about.
And I don't think it has to be either or. There are quite a few models where there's a portion of unpaid student teaching that transitions directly into a paid internship in the same setting for continuity with the students, but also to provide a clear student teaching experience of gradual release where they are absolutely observing and watching their mentor and growing from their mentor, and then slowly assuming responsibility. And with this responsibility becomes pay. So I think there's a very clear delineation of what your role is, who's supporting you, and how much support you have. And I think that model actually could be replicated in rural areas very successfully. And to your point, Cheryl, sometimes the question of whether or not student teachers get paid is not a hypothetical. It's something we're all grappling with, not just because students want to be done and they want to be out, but because, as Chris said, schools are asking. I know we get these calls all the time. Schools are saying, we have a vacancy. Do you have any student teachers? They're not asking who just graduated this year to fill this position. They're saying, please send us a student teacher and we'll guarantee them a job. So I think that there are some external factors, whether we want to talk about these ideas or not, we need to. Now,
Yes.
how that all plays into Chapter 58 is very complicated, because now in essence, we've eliminated even more time. To Trisha's point about the 120 nuggets and the ongoing conversation about time, if we say, sure, we've got a student teacher for you, they're ready to take the reins, well, then maybe what have we done incredibly right, or what are we doing really wrong to put a student in that position? So we've either fast tracked our programs and said in 3.5 years, you can be ready if they're progressing at typical speed, or we're saying they're not ready and we're still going to put them there. So I think that does have repercussions toward educator prep because we're setting the parameters here. What are we requiring? And is that even possible in less than 120 credits? There are quite a few states where you're required to get your master's degree in rapid succession of your bachelor's degree because those states are acknowledging it's just not enough time. So what are we expecting? And is that a reasonable expectation for a typical 22-year-old? So second career folks, many of us now have fast-track programs, post-bac programs, MATs. We're all moving toward, you're a functioning adult with lots of life experience. So you can maybe hit the ground running. And for our traditional, typically developing kids who are learning to be grown-ups while they're also learning to be teachers. I was a 22-year-old classroom teacher. I don't know that I would do that again. So I think when we're talking about Chapter 58, it's so much more than for our LEDs particularly. We go around and around on all the science content they need, and I'm not going to say they don't need science content. And there's so many other things playing into this discussion, and we're under a deadline. We're expected to say, this is what Chapter 58 looks like right now, which is also ever evolving. So I think it's really complicated, as we all know, as I'm sure we lose sleep over all the time.
Exactly. So I'll share a brief conversation I had 2 weeks ago. So I am very intrigued by Conrad Wolfram's work in mathematics. And the more and more that I have been in and around in many facets, I'm utterly convinced that there's two critical concept areas that our students need. One is reading, but our teachers need to understand the science of reading. English is a very complex language. It's not a simple language. And too often our classroom teachers understand teaching reading from the premise that kids already know how to read. And we can look at literacy data around that. The second area is mathematics. And I noticed an interesting phenomenon, and it still continues. People are really reticent to say they don't know how to read. But when you bring up mathematics, people tend to laugh about it and say, oh, but I wasn't good at math, so I'm not surprised my kids aren't good at math. My parents weren't. So all of a sudden it's like mathematics and the brain working is a DNA factor, which we know that's not the case. So Conrad Wolfram, he's out of England, and they're doing a lot of work with university systems around the planet at this time. And they said a month ago, they had a conversation with Oxford, and their conversation was around that they have undergraduates that don't have the problem solving skills, that don't have the data science skills, that don't have the ability to take data and be able to analyze it and solve problems from it. And Oxford went on to say, and we're finding the same thing into our graduate programs. And I said, well, tell me about the K-12 world, the pre-K-12. He said, what we're seeing is an interesting phenomenon that the age is getting younger and younger in which children are disengaging from mathematics. So I look at those and totally agree that it's very complex and complicated. And so at the simplest of the core, if I were to talk only content and I had to choose, I would be choosing mathematics and reading as those foundationals around the whole child approach to capabilities. And from that, I'm a big believer that today it's about student-driven curriculum and content. It's not about teacher-driven. So it's one of those shifting that, again, if we're going to meet kids where they are, and we're going to individualize, and we're going to build purpose and passion of students, the idea of the traditional content, a little bit of science, a little bit of math, a lot of language arts, a little bit of history, a little bit of art, a little bit of music, a little bit of current technical education isn't working. And I'll be quiet after this thought. I was on a call with the superintendent from Billings. So Billings graduates our largest number of students because it serves our largest student population in the state. So we were on a regional call, and he asked the question of the chief of staff for one of the US senators on the Senate Education Committee. He said, I don't even know what the purpose of K-12 education is anymore. Don't even know what its purpose is. And the chief of staff responded, well, your purpose is to do everything. And what you're describing from Educator Prep as well is that construct of, well, we're expected to do everything to prepare our teachers, and we know we can't do everything, that it's that ongoing lifelong journey on that path. Greg went on to say, 75% of my graduates end up blowing in the wind. That was his way of saying that they don't know what they're going to do with their lives. About 50% actually enroll in post-secondary. Of that 50%, just under 25% actually complete a post-secondary credential, if you would. He said, so I take the 50% that never enter post-secondary, the 25% that come back. And he said, I'm utterly convinced I have to do more in the skilled trades areas with my students in high school. Don't know that I disagree with that. I'm keenly committed to students finding that there's purpose and meaning in their lives, and that for which they have passion is what really gets supported around them as you look at those whole child entities. Thoughts?
I would argue that we're seeing the consequences of social studies not being a tested subject. And I don't mean this in a flip way, and I'm not necessarily, supporting how No Child Left Behind structured assessment for students. But I think, one of the, in listening to you, Cheryl, talk about, purposes of K-12 education, that used to be sort of crystal clear. I mean, if we go back to some of the founders and what they were writing about the purposes of education, being how to be a citizen. And I think, this past year in particular has really demonstrated how, one, we don't understand sort of the political and economic institutions in our country, and we don't understand how to talk with one another in ways where we can sort of support a conversation and disagree with one another and hammer things out in ways that don't involve a lot of finger pointing or guns or, something that becomes very amped up very quickly. So I think, we've forgotten how to do that. And some of that I know is related to the last 20 years of, stripping back. And I've seen schools totally strip out, social studies or related content areas where students learn how to engage socially with ideas, with data, with questions that provoke critical thinking. So I would just add to what you were saying.
I appreciate that and wouldn't argue with you on that. So when you look at the history of education, I'm looking at many of you, and I'm absolutely certain that perhaps A Nation at Risk was before your time. So I was a beginning teacher in Montana when A Nation at Risk hit the forefront. And then we can watch those migrations. I'm utterly convinced that statewide assessments are meaningless and useless. And I'm not wanting to step on anyone's toes with that. But as I listened to Secretary Cardona, when he first took office and talked about, we have to test our kids this spring. We have to do statewide assessments, must be done. And the question was, and what's the purpose? He said, we don't want it to be used to measure achievement or hold anyone accountable. We need to test them for policy purposes and know how to spend money. Those were our two purposes. And he went on to say, and we need to completely redo assessment in our country. I agree with that. As I was looking at Dr. McNulty's work as well, there's lots of folks out there banging that drum that we've gotten off track with assessment and this idea that high stakes testing is what it's all about for our kids. I can tell you what we're looking at right now in Montana, and we're in preliminary stages, as how we take the formative assessments that are already used by our local school districts, and how we take those formative assessments and are able to translate those to providing the data that the feds need and the data that our state legislators need and the data that parents are seeking to show the growth of students, to show that where Cheryl started and where Cheryl is shows that yes, she is learning and she is growing, as opposed to the statewide assessment. So in the conversations that we're having with experts across the country, they said it's what every state yearns to be able to do. We just haven't figured out how to do it yet. So we've got a partner, and that's what we're working to say, can we actually take those formative and interim assessments that school districts are using and translate that into the meaningful data that policy makers are seeking. And we think the answer to that is yes. I can tell you, we don't have a single school district yet that has said that's a bad idea. But maybe it is. But we're seeking folks to tell us that's a really bad idea. And then it plays, if we're able to accomplish that, then it plays into educator prep and what does assessment look like differently. So why did things get scaled back? Because it became all about the test. And I remember when I took a superintendency in Montana, I had a 5th grade teacher come up to me, experienced, skilled, incredible teacher. She came up to me in the opening day and said, I have a question. And I knew I was being set up. You know when you're being set up. I said, let's have it. When can we go back to teaching? And then went on to say she felt such pressure to prepare her students for the statewide assessment that it was like the joy of teaching had disappeared for her. So I'll tell you another time how I answered that, but would leave that with you. What would be your response when the joy and the purpose of why I became a teacher is becoming secondary to the I need to get my kids to where they can do better on that test that's going to get published and going to determine what our accreditation status is and whether we're a targeted or comprehensive school or how parents moving into the area are going to determine if we're a good or bad school system. All of those measures that might have a good measure of fallacy to those. Because Gallup also did studies on this, and I'm sure you're aware of this, but they found an interesting phenomenon in local school communities. They all thought their schools were doing really well, but when you put it to a global, education was doing a really bad job. So I'm like, well, logically and mathematically, that doesn't make sense to me. If at the local level, they're all doing well, the sum of the parts would equate to a different story. So I think you're absolutely right. There's far more complex issues that we're going to be digging through and working through. And I anticipate that this isn't going to be a start finish. We don't do this again for 6 or 7 years, but it's going to become an ongoing process of how we look at our chapters, at least at the OPI and those partnerships that help us. So. Any other final thoughts, comments?
I was just curious, Cheryl, who is on the actual task force for the Chapter 58 revisions? I was just wondering who's representing that work. And I was also wondering kind of timeline for drafts, when we might start to see some language for this group to reflect on. I appreciate this kind of foundation laying session that we've had now. And I'm just kind of looking ahead to, what the full timeline looks like. So can you share who the work group for the revisions are?
I'll have Tristan send those out to all of you so you can see who's on that.
Perfect.
And then the other thing is revisions will be underway in July. We anticipate first recommendation of revisions will go to the Board of Public Ed at their September Board of Public Ed meeting. We're targeting right now that at least in this process, the last of revisions will go to the Board of Public Ed in January. And that's because it takes 3 Board of Public Ed meetings for any revisions to actually become adopted, if you would.
Yeah.
And that's why I preface that with, I'm a firm believer that this is continuous work. And as we see that there's issues with our accreditation process, or we see that there's issues in chapters or other elements of multiple chapters that we deal with, it can't just be when it's time to revise. It's got to become a continuous process for us. And obviously we can't do this work without you, nor would we want to do this work without you. Let me add that as well. Appreciate you being here this morning. Would anticipate when we get together in July, we will have sent you revision work that comes out of the task force prior to that. And have a wonderful week.
Thank you.
Thanks,
So
everybody.
much. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.